So the 1980s and the 1990s had very clear and specific conditionalities, but they were mainly ignored. How is that possible? Well, let me give you one side of the explanation at least. My explanation needs to start with a question, and the question is, do donors to the rich countries, do they know that the conditionalities are not being respected? And sadly, the answer is yes, they know this. Actually, the World Bank did a study, and the study revealed that 85% of the international aid is used for other purposes, so for other reasons than for which it was given. When I read this, I first wanted to cry and then scream. How is it possible that we know that aid is not used properly and yet we're still giving the money? That just baffles me. I just don't understand this. And I have, as we saw, right, 2013, we're still giving development aid. In 1997, the World Bank Operations Evaluation Department released the fact that we give aid almost always 100%, even when countries respect conditionalities by less than 50%. Right? So we know and we still give. That I just don't understand. And Johan Svensson has a quote that summarizes it all, that there is no link, no connection between a country's reform effort or fulfillment of conditionality and the disbursement rate of aid funds. So, however you're using the money, you're still getting the money, even if you're not using the money for the right reasons. That, to me, is unacceptable. So I tried to understand why this is happening, and the reasons are pretty scary as far as I'm concerned. One of the reasons why we still give international aid to countries that we know don't use international aid for the right reasons, it's our motivation. So economic motivation, and a lot of countries are actually benefiting from lending that money. Political motivation, you want to keep good political relationship or political control over some countries, and the moral motivation, thinking that it is our duty to help developing countries. The second reason why we give money to countries we know will not use it the right way is actually connected to the economic system around international aid. Well, there's a huge pressure to lend. About 500,000 people, that's the population of Swaziland. It's a small country in Africa. So imagine the population of a small country is working in aid-related positions, right? So basically, it is a whole economy built on giving international aid. And another aspect is that success is not measured by how the aid is actually used, which we would think for the right purpose. No, it's only based on how much you lend. Right? So it's not how it's used, it's how much you lend. So basically, your only goal in this situation is lend money. You don't care how it's used because you will be evaluated. You will be judged by the amount of money you gave. So that clearly doesn't help implementing strict rules in how the money is used. In addition, if an organization don't lend the money as enough money, the following year the budget is likely to decrease, which means that the wages of people might decrease and some people might lose their job because they don't have enough budget to pay everybody. And this is something we actually see in a few countries, including Japan. Now we're towards the end of the year, and all the different parts of the government are looking at their budget, and they realize, ooh, we haven't spent it all. And if we don't spend it all, next year we will have less. So let's spend the rest of that money. And that's why maybe near your house you see a lot of road construction. And it's not because it's absolutely necessary. You may have the road construction just because the budget needs to be used. So in a way, we're just wasting this money, because if the construction is not necessary, why do we have it? Well, we have it so that next year's budget will not be reduced. This part of the government will still receive the same amount of money. And it's the same with international aid. They want to keep their budget because they want to keep their wages. They don't want to lose their jobs, so they just keep giving the money. Another reason why we give money to countries, even though we know they are not going to spend it the right way, is that the lenders, right, the rich people, the rich countries, they cannot agree on which countries are corrupt and which are not. And that, to me, I'm sorry, my reaction is, really? You actually have organizations dedicated to evaluating corruption level, right? The map I showed you before. How is that possible? How can they not agree on who's corrupt and who's not corrupt, right? Isn't there a way for them to use, external organization like transparency.org so that they can evaluate? Can they agree on their criteria, how they judge that a country is corrupt? That just baffles me. And I have an interesting but sad example related to developed countries not agreeing on who's corrupt and who's not corrupt. So the New York Times reported in 2002 about a plan of the Bush administration, and basically the Bush administration started a competition between the poorest world economies. And they said, well, we will give you money, so the foreign aid, if, again, the conditionality, you have a free market that we talked about earlier, and civic rule. So this is another way of saying democracy. Right? And the winner would get $5 billion in foreign aid. This is a huge number, right? So, not going to comment about the competition thing, but focus on the fact that the United Kingdom and the US could not agree on who is corrupt and who is not corrupt. So the country here was Tanzania. For the US, Tanzania was not a possible candidate. It was not good enough with its free market and its civic rule, so the democracy thing. But according to the UK, actually Tanzania was a model of good governance, right? So the whole democracy, good laws, no corruption. In November 2001, they had said the country was a model, right? So an example that other countries should choose. So clearly Tanzania didn't get the money from the US, but received a new aid program from the UK. I just don't get it. I feel helpless when I see these type of situations. So yes, the 1980s and the 1990s conditionalities were ignored without consequences, right? So we talked about the conditionalities. Let me summarize why there weren't any consequences. There weren't any consequences because developed countries had economic, political, and moral motivation to not stop giving the money. They were also under pressure to lend the money. And there was no agreement on who is corrupt or not corrupt, which means no agreement on who can or cannot receive international aid. And as we've seen, this is definitely not a good situation because we're not truly helping developing countries, but it's also a recipe for a disaster. And I wonder how many of you have heard about the Malawi famine in 2002. And it's a painful example. I will use a picture that does make me extremely sad. It's a picture of Luke Perry. But it's a painful example that we need to better understand the connection between international aid and poverty, and also to better understand the news. This is the picture of Luke Perry. It was on the front page of the Daily Mirror in 2002 with the title "Africa is Dying Again." Beyond the picture, let's try to understand why the Daily Mirror used such a dramatic title, Africa is Dying Again. So why is Africa dying again? One of the reasons is a natural disaster, right here. And they say in the article that because of excessive rain, so too much rain, and prolonged drought, so a drought that lasts for a long time, because of that, the maize harvest, the maize is a type of cereal grown in Malawi, and that is part of the standard diet in Malawi, is depleted, so not as important as before. So it's a very small harvest. They focus on natural disaster. They also mention structural adjustment policies, and basically it's the conditionalities we were talking about, right? They just mention them. They don't really go into details. I will go into details. So the conditionalities were not just imposed by donor countries, right? So the countries with the money, but also promoted by the IMF, so the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. So these conditionalities, as we saw, are connected mainly to the liberalization of agricultural policy, so meaning less help from the government. So for instance, no more subsidies, no more help in the form of money for small farmers, and no more price control, right? So that's it. Price is free to be whatever the market decides it is. And also privatization, one of the conditionalities. And in this case, in Malawi, it was social agencies, so social organization that used to help with food insecurity. Malawi has always been a country with high food insecurity. Yeah. So conditionalities, liberalization of agricultural policy, and privatization of social agencies that used to help with the food insecurity. And also, there is at least one political factor, is that the government of Malawi was corrupt. So what happened? Well, actually, Malawi's Minister of Agriculture did warn about a forthcoming food deficit. So he warned the other members of the government that they will probably have a problem with food, not having enough food. But at the same time as the warning came out, Malawi was removed from the highly indebted poor country interim debt relief program. This means that Malawi was on a program that allowed the country to not pay back its debt, right? It was like, okay, you are way too much in debt, you're okay, don't pay them back right now, right? But it was removed from that program because of government's corruption. So it was removed from the program, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, recommended that the country sell 2/3, right? So just keep 1/3 of the grain, of the cereal reserves, so that they could repay a loan from South Africa, right? So now that they're not on this program, they have to pay back their debt. And the IMF said, well, I guess a way to pay back the loan is by selling your cereal stock, the grain stocks. Well, the government, being corrupt, went beyond the recommendation and sold all of the grain stocks. So the government had no more stock of food, of cereals. They sold it to private traders, and the private traders are greedy. They want to make money. They want to maximize profit. So they stocked all of that food so that without price control, well, the price of maize, again, this is the main cereal in Malawi, rose by 400% in 6 months. And as I said before, Malawi has always been very sensitive to food shortage, to not having enough food. So this just increased the the difficulty of accessing food, right? 400%, right? Time 4. So in the long term, this leads to a famine, right? When people don't have enough food to eat. And actually, an observer, S. Dover, says something that to me highlights the true causes of a famine. And he says, famines are always a problem of disrupted access to food, right? So you don't have access to food because of political economy, as much as restricted availability because of natural triggers, right? Like natural disaster. So it's not just about natural disaster. We know by now that it's also the political economy, the decisions made at the political level that creates those problems. We know that famines are not just a problem of natural disasters, but also problems related to politics and the economy. But when you look at this picture, does it explain the role played by international aid and developmental, and I have developmental in quotation, organizations? And I think it doesn't, and I think this is not right. People should be made aware that when they're asked to give money, it's because initially international aid was not working and made people take bad decisions. So I think this type of pictures might trigger an emotional reaction. People feel sad, people feel they have to help, but they don't know what is really happening. And in the long term, I do not think that these type of pictures help change the system. That's why I also think that in understanding international aid is a way for us to be better at being critical when we analyze the news. And also, when I learned of this, when I realized what was happening in terms of famine, for me, I found a way to fight what seemed in the past impossible to stop, right? I always felt overwhelmed. How can I stop famines? How can I stop people from dying of starvation? I really felt it was not possible. Once I learned about international aid and the impact it has on countries, I realized, no, there is a way to fight. So now, when I look at the picture of Luc Pierry, I realize he's not a victim of bad luck, but he's a victim of bad aid. And that has given me immense motivation, a huge motivation to try to help and make a real difference. This is the end of the flipped activities for this week. Thank you very much. References are listed on the next slide.